Hi everybody, thank you for connecting with me today. I appreciate you giving me a few minutes of your time, and I really do hope that our time together today actually makes a difference in your life this week. I hope that this is something that you can apply and help to better your life, right? So you know that we're in this series, we're talking about the parables that Jesus told, these little stories that are very simple and memorable stories, but are also very profound, have potential to really make a difference in our lives. And our story this week really fits that description, right? This week we're talking about the story that Jesus said about building our house on shifting sand or building it on solid rock, and then when the storms come, and withstanding the storms. And but before we get to that story, I think it's really important for us to understand the context of where this story is found, right? So this story is told both in Matthew 7 and in Luke 6, right? Two places, two writers that captured this story. And this story is found at the very end of what we call the Sermon on the Mount, right? So in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gives some really, really good life advice on how to actually find happiness and fulfillment, and how to find ourselves in a place that is blessed, right? Being blessed by God, right? And so in the Sermon on the Mount, of course, Jesus, says, God blesses those who are poor and realize their need of Him. God blesses those who mourn. God blesses those who are humble. God blesses those who hunger and thirst for justice. God blesses those who are merciful, those whose hearts are pure, those who work for peace. And God even blesses those who are persecuted for doing right? And that's what, of course, we call the Beatitudes, right? Jesus gives all of these things. But then Jesus goes on to give more really good life advice. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 21, he talks about how to handle anger when it arises, right? In Matthew 5:27, he talks about how to manage our sex life. In chapter 6, verse 19, he talks about our money and our possessions and how to manage that stuff. And then in chapter 7, Matthew 7, verse 12, Jesus gives the golden rule, right? This memorable golden rule that most people would be able to recite about doing unto others what we want them to do to us, right? So in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, Jesus gives this really, really good life advice, and we would all do well, to adopt this, right? And then at the end of the sermon, Jesus says something that ties this whole thing together. And what he says at the end of the sermon is the key to unlocking this whole thing, right? He says at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, anyone who listens to my teaching and follows it, we talked about listening last week. Anyone who listens to my teaching and follows it is like a person who builds a house on solid rock. Though the rain comes and the torrents and the floodwaters rise and the winds beat against that house, it won't collapse because it's built on bedrock. In verse 26, anyone who hears my teaching and doesn't obey it is foolish, like a person who builds a house on sand. When the rains and floodwaters come and the winds beat against that house, it will collapse in a mighty crash. I love that visual image. It'll collapse in a mighty crash. Now, before we go any further, I want to capture something that kind of validates what I was saying about this section being at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. I always think it's interesting how different translations handle different sections of Scripture differently. And you know that most times I would quote from the New Living Translation. I just like the fresh language that it uses. But in this case, I think the New Living Translation loses something, a piece of what we're talking about. The New Living Translation, you remember what I just read, says that anyone who listens to my teaching. The other translations, the NIV, the King James Version, other translations put in the word therefore. And that word therefore in the Greek is oun, O-U-N. But that word therefore it ties back to everything that Jesus said previously. That's right. So Jesus gives the Sermon on the Mount, all this really great teaching. And then he said, therefore, anyone who listens to all of what I just said, that word therefore ties those two sections together, right? So I think that's important because it clarifies in our mind that this little story that Jesus told is tied to all the really good life advice that he gives previously. Okay, so that's fine. Now, I want to highlight something else here that I think is helpful for us to understand. When we read like today in 2023, especially in our lovely community of Stouffville, when we read, about anyone who listens to my teaching is wise, person who builds a house on solid rock. When the rain comes, flood waters and beat against the house, the house will stand, right? We go, well, of course the house will stand, right? Like with our modern building techniques and our modern building standards, of course the house will stand, right? And for a house to collapse, like Jesus described in verse 27, when the rains and floods come and the winds beat against that house, it will collapse with a mighty crash. For a house to collapse, like a finished house, I've seen houses that have collapsed, because of wind that aren't finished. But for a finished house to collapse, because of a rainstorm, apart from a hurricane, and that's a totally different category, that's just unheard of, especially for us here, in Stouffville in the year 2023. But it's important for us to understand that in Israel there were a few things that made this very real for Jesus's listeners. The first thing is that in Israel, back in Jesus's day, and even still today, there are nomadic tribes, the shepherd tribes, the nomadic tribes, the Bedouins, B-E-D-O-U-I-N, the Bedouin tribes. And the Bedouin tribes travel from place to place in the rainy season and the dry season. They follow their herd, they follow their animals, their herds, or they lead the herds, to where they can find food. And so even today, the Bedouin tribes' homes, we saw some of them when we were in Israel just in January. Even today, the Bedouin homes are very temporary structures, right? And so they're not homes like what we would envision, living in today. They're temporary structures, and they'll move around from place to place. The second thing that's important for us to understand is that in Israel, large parts of Israel are actually like literally a desert that the rainfall, the annual rainfall falls below the threshold to be considered a desert. In fact, it falls well below, right? And so large parts of Israel are considered desert. Now, with modern irrigation, the Israelis are able to kind of grow things, but they're deserts. And large parts are covered with like sand, right? And large parts are covered with like deep sand, right? So, again, in Stouffville in 2023, we talk about, building on sand, and we go, well, okay, like whatever, like a builder would never, build on, but building on sand was something that the Jewish people, the Israelis, they understood it, and even today would understand that, because they understand that large parts, again, of their land is covered with sand. The third thing that's helpful for us to understand that we can't quite wrap our head around here in Stouffville in the year 2023 is that even today, when Israel has torrential downpours, and when those torrential downpours happen during the rainy season, dry riverbeds can very quickly turn into rushing rivers. In fact, when we were in Israel just in January, our tour guide said that it's not uncommon for hikers to be killed every year because of flash floods, because a storm that could be miles away, all of this water is dumped maybe on the side of a mountain, and the water rushes down in the gullies or in the valleys, running along the mountains. And a person hiking up there or down there is caught up in the flood and they're swept away. And so torrential downpours and floods that happen on dry riverbeds, you would never know it, but it's a dry riverbed, it actually happens and people actually die, right? So putting all of that together, today we go, torrential downpours and houses collapsing, that we just don't understand that. But in Jesus's day, in the land of Israel, and even today, this visual image is something, that they would understand and they would resonate with. Okay, I'd like to just in a couple of minutes share a couple of thoughts that I have, in regard to this story. My first thought is that this is such a simple message. And again, these parables are very, very simple and memorable stories. And this is such a simple message that for many of us who are followers of Jesus, we would say, this message of actually do what Jesus says, is such a simple message that we would go, well, yeah, of course. Right? Like that's what we try to do. We try to build our life on what Jesus says. Everybody says, yeah, of course, do what Jesus says, but it's actually harder to actually, live that out, right? We are all on a journey of trying to live our best life, become the best version of ourselves, that we can be, right? We're all on that life journey. And along the way, in that journey, we all try to, to practice what Jesus said. And I'd like to give you a challenge this week that will kind of maybe bring this right down. Of course, this story of doing what Jesus says, actually practicing what he taught, is tied to the Sermon on the Mount, right? My challenge for you this week is that if you would read Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount, but read it in small chunks. And after you read a small section of the Sermon on the Mount, pause and ponder and ask, Jesus, are you saying something to me here? Is there some area of my life here that I'm not living out actually fully, what you're teaching, right? And here's our personal reflection question that I want you to think about. Where are the gaps in my life between who I want to be and who I am? Or in other words, where are the gaps between the person that Jesus is calling me to be in the teaching and how I'm actually living my life, right? Where are the gaps between who I want to be and who I am? So my first thought is to, just do it, right? Like actually live out, the teaching of Jesus and what Jesus has to say. My second thought is around this imagery of a rock. This imagery of God as a rock is very common in the Old Testament. In Psalm 18, verses 1 and 2, David is writing here and he says, I love you, Lord. You are my strength. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my Savior. My God is my rock, in whom I find protection. He is my shield, the power that saves me, and my place of safety, right? So this imagery that David uses ties directly to the story, and we hear the same concepts and the same imagery, in what Jesus said, right? And so here's our second personal reflection question that I'd like you to think about. In what ways would I benefit from strengthening the foundation of my life on my relationship with Jesus, right? If Jesus is my rock and my fortress, in what ways would I benefit from strengthening the foundation of my life, strengthening the foundation of my life in my relationship with Jesus? Okay? So friends, our time has gone quickly today, and again, I thank you for connecting with me, and I really do hope that as you ponder these two personal reflection questions about the gaps in my life of who I want to be and who I actually am, and the second one about strengthening our foundation in our relationship with Jesus, I hope that those questions just kind of rattle around in your brain a little bit this week, and I hope it actually makes a difference in how you live, okay? Thank you so much for connecting with me. Look forward to seeing you on Sunday at Latcham Hall. God bless you, friends.